structure of this wonderful course. So we continue with morphology, and I think this talk should in principle take an hour. Although I feel that we might be able to skip over a few things because, on the one hand, Alina nicely introduced a few morphological topics, and some of the things I introduced in my first talk. So let's see how we go on. But still, do not hesitate to interrupt if you feel something is unclear. So we're going to continue with the topic of neurophysiological investigation of linguistics, or linguistic issues, or psycholinguistic issues. And I'll make an introduction where I describe a little bit the tools that we're going to use, and I described that already in the first talk, so we'll try to get through this reasonably quickly. And then we'll cover a few topics relevant for morphology, and I'll make examples of how we can use neurophysiological tools to address questions such as particle verbs, compounds, past tense, as well as derivations versus inflections. That was pretty much covered by Alina, so we might actually skip over this last part. So that's the question which the morphology stems from. So what is a basic unit of language perception? That's something that's still being discussed. Do we perceive things in phonemes? Do we put phonemes together, or do we put syllables together? Do we parse words into syllables, or is it morphemes? Or maybe whole words or phrases? It sounds like a silly question, but we could probably make it a little bit more precise. What is basically meaningful unit of language? Are these single words? Still a silly question, but it becomes perhaps less clear cut when you get to complex words. So with monomorphic simple words, you can say, of course, it's a word is a unit it's the unit you perceive and the unit that you store. Words like coffee, sleep, sweet, nice, sweet, monomorphic words. Now, but when we get to complex words, such as compounds, coffee maker, is this a single word, or are these two words, in fact? A word which contains a derivation affix, such as sleepless. How is that analyzed? How is that stored in your mental lexicon, or is that stored at all? Or inflection, such as sweet versus sweets, plural. So once we get to complex forms, it gets a little bit complicated. There are multiple ways of producing them. You can have inflections, derivations, compounds, other things. That depends on the language. We're going to be pretty much stuck with English for the rest of the talk, and that's the one, as Justina mentioned yesterday, with very poor morphology. Yeah, probably the most studied. It makes it worse if you go a little further. The properties of these words, as Alina mentioned, they can vary in their transparency in relation to the base form. For example, sleep and sleepless is pretty transparent. It's closely related to sleep. It's not heavy one. Now, when you get to something like sweat and sweater, it's not the same level of transparency as work and worker, right? When you get to corn and corner, an example I made already, there is no transparency at all, right? So these two forms are not related. Look at other examples of compound words. Compare workman with handyman, which is almost the same thing, but probably a different level of transparency in terms of relatedness to the base form. So workman is a man who works. Handyman is a kind of man who is, by your hand when you need some help, but not really so transparent. And snowman isn't really a man, right? But he's made of snow. On the other hand, fireman is a man, but isn't really made of fire, right? So there are all kinds of complexities that exist in this morphological business, and we're not going to cover all of them because nobody has. But these are things to keep in mind. So, coming back to the same question that Alina was asking, when we look at these morphologically complex words, are they real mental objects? Are they really represented in our lexicon in the same way as monomorphic, simple items? Or are they more of a result of a linkage between different morphemes In a similar way, perhaps words can be linked in a sentence, syntactically or semantically. To put it differently, are there supralexical representations for complex words? Are there super representations for something like coffee maker? Or are they linked syntactically, and do you have to parse it into a thing that makes coffee? This is something that has been discussed in linguistics, and especially psycholinguistics, for a long time, and there are arguments to both sides, to both ends. And the brain, as we like to believe, as the processor responsible for all this business, can perhaps provide an answer for this. Now, the tool that I'm going to use for the rest of this is the one I described to you in the first talk. That's the set of mismatch negativity studies that I described that use passive eventuated responses that show specific syntactic and lexical patterns. Now, you'll remember that's non-attempt design, so you get these effects when subjects are distracted, they don't do any tasks, and you have just a few items presented in an oddball random deviance. You can also do it with multiple items, as I showed you, with many different ones, as long as you match them closely. So I showed you this thing before, but I need to remind you, and I was expecting a question about the discrepancy between lexical and syntactic data. As I haven't got one, I'll talk to you about this anyway. So you will remember what I mentioned. Subjects don't pay any attention to words, they're distracted, they listen to words and pseudo words, they get a nicely increased word response. Early on. Automatic word memory trace activation, which we like to believe happens quickly, somewhere in the left peripheral areas here. That's very nice. I showed you this, you can see it with fMRI. I showed you how you can see it in normal ball designs as well, in imaging. So we have this early lexical response, enhanced in passive conditions, observed when you properly control acoustics and phonetics. That is easy to mess up. Best explained by activation of long-term memory traces for words. In principle, this similar findings for this could be found for any long-term memory representations, including, for example, sounds of familiar actions. We find these effects for sounds like you have a representation for that. So language is not unique in that sense. Or you have it for things like, which in some cultures mean something. Even environmental sounds, door sounds, telephone sounds, they have their representation. So that's more universal phenomenon. So that's something that's stored in the auditory memory, perhaps. And as I told you, these show specific semantic properties, show word frequency effects. So we have an index of lexical representation activation, or memory trace activation, which can be automatically obtained with no linguistic task. But what happens when we look at syntactic processes, when things are processed combinatorially, as in syntax? The same thing. I showed you an example of a Finnish study and an English one. Remember, the example was we come versus becomes. So that's a translation of what was done in the Finnish case, more or less. Again, the same contrast, non-attend, passive presentation of syntactic contrasts, leads to a different result. You get a strong response to syntactically incongruous combinations. So when you have we comes rather than he comes, for example, you get this, you get a larger response. So that's well, I've shown all this, I'll just skip over this. So it's a comparable index. We can get the same thing in the same task, but it shows the opposite pattern. Familiar word, larger response than non-familiar, than unknown pseudo word. An incongruous combination of two items in a syntactic context, larger response than congruous combination. So exactly the opposite pattern. We can talk more about what causes this, if you want, or we can get on and just say that this is a clear double dissociation. This was mentioned yesterday by which is the best testing case for it. So now we can look what happens with congruous versus incongruous combinations of two morphemes. We can take complex words which include more than one morpheme, say a stem and an affix, or maybe a combination of two words in a compound, and make them congruous or incongruous, like Lee was shown in some of her experiments, and see how do they behave in this passive body representation. Do they show large activation for congruous, meaningful combinations, which would be a sign of lexical activity or lexical intelligence? Or do they show a syntactic pattern, a combinatorial pattern, where a mismatch between items in a combination causes this outburst of activity? So that's what we'll be doing for the next half an hour, I think, with a few cases. So we can simply test these things and see what happens, whether the brain can tell us how it stores these things, whether it stores these things, or whether it pauses them. And the first example I'd like to make is that of particle verbs, and that usually causes excitement in Germanic, especially English linguistics. I'm not sure that's of any relevance to Finnish or Slavic-speaking audience, but it's a very good example because it's something that was studied in behavioral literature and was never concluded. There was never a conclusion to that. This was done by Berke Pelle from the University of Leuven. He's now in Liège, I think, who visited Cambridge for 2 years, and he made his career out of studying phrasal or particle verbs. Do you know what particle verbs are? You may know, you may not know. It's thing ubiquitous in Germanic languages, but especially in English. So you have verbs that are made up of a verb and a particle. Wake up, come along, sit down, drink up, dig in, show off, go away, shut up, you may want to say to a speaker. And they may be different. They may be closely related, again, they may be transparent in relation to what makes them up. Come back is fully transparent. It implies both words are fully transparently related to the particle verb. But chill out or come up is not really transparent anymore. So they have this. And it's been a long-standing controversy, and this is a quote from Chomsky, who wrote a long time ago that for his theory, these verb-particle combinations pose a variety of problems. Whether these are parsed or whether these are stored as a single thing, nobody could satisfactorily answer. There are proofs to both positions. So, could they be unitary lexical units by themselves? Are they assembled as combinations of two items similar to words in a sentence, syntactically? Is one question. The second question, could this in fact depend on their meaning? So maybe when something is transparent, such as walk in, stand up, then it's reasonably easy to parse this, to segment this, and therefore you might treat it in the same way as you treat a phrase, syntactic way, but perhaps some combinations that are not so transparent, such as show off or chill out, they benefit from single representation and would therefore be stored as single supralexical units, so to speak, super words. So this has not been resolved before, and what we did was apply exactly this paradigm that I just described to the case of particle verbs. So as I said, the previous research showed increased oddball response to words as opposed to non-words, but a smaller response to coherent phrases, combinations, as opposed to incoherent ones. So let's do this. Let's take these particle verbs, and let's take coherent combinations. Heat up, or rise up. And let's take those that do not exist. Heat down. That doesn't make any sense. But nothing stops you from putting those two things together. And see whether these incongruous combinations show a lexical effect, so that is larger response to meaningful items, or a syntactic effect, larger response to incongruous combinations. Well, this is Steven's design. pretty complicated, just to show you that the acoustics was mentioned as much as possible, and a small set of items was combined with these particles up and down. And importantly, we had both metaphoric, both literal sense. So we had items like fall down, transparent, literal meaning, and we had metaphoric meaning, cool down. Cooling down does not actually mean bringing anything from upper shelf to a lower shelf. The same with rise up, which is a literal meaning, or heat up. Why do we say up? Why do we want to change the position for heating things up? So there is this contrast between metaphorical and literal combinations, and half of these are fully meaningful. So the ones that you know: fall down, rise up, cool down, heat up, and then the opposite: fall up, rise down, cool up, heat down. And let's look at what happened with the brain response. This is an energy signal. This is, like I said, an English data recording in an energy machine in Cambridge. Actually, one of the first experiments that we ran after acquiring our machine in 2006. This was, I think, run in 2007, early 2008, and published by Birds later in Brain and Language. And that's a global response across all energy sensors that shows a clear difference. You can see that real phrasal verbs produce a larger response in this non-attempt. It's again a non-attempt passive presentation, so the subject is distracted from these sounds. And you see, although it's actually time-locked in response to similar questions, time-locked to the onset of up or down. So the critical point when you know what's going to happen. So, and it's the same ups and downs across both situations. So acoustics is fully matched in that sense. It's the same items, just mixed up differently. So when we look at these responses, we find that in this case, in 180, 200 milliseconds, we have an increased response. Well, it starts before, but that's where it reaches significance. For real phrasal verbs, as opposed to meaningless combinations. And it's maximal over left hemisphere. Let's see what happens when we look at statistics for literal versus, so literal rise up, as opposed to metaphoric heat up situations. We have here on the left is the real phrasal verbs. You see a difference between them and the non-existent combinations, the larger response. But what we don't see is any difference between transparent and metaphorical in one case, and transparent and metaphorical in the other case, which is rather interesting in itself. Well, that's just a topography. You see this bilateral response, stronger on the left hemisphere. We can try to put sources on it, again, sources in temporal lobes on both sides, and also in posterior frontal parts of the brain. So what we see from this study is, early on, the brain shows larger passive audible response for the same particle when it forms part of a real meaningful phrasal verb, such as fall down. And this response is larger than the same things I included in non-existing, unknown, incongruous combinations, such as rise down. And this is true, statistically at least, for both literal and metaphoric combinations. So the only thing we can conclude, if we believe the initial logic that I suggested, is that these particle verbs, so the verb and the particle taken together, they actually form one single representation, which is sometimes called in linguistics a chunk, a lexical chunk. Interestingly, that happens even when the combination is fully analyzable. Nothing stops you from parsing fall down into fall and down. But it seems to show this effect equally for literal and metaphoric combinations. So it seems like these possess unified cortical memory traces, which behave rather similar to those that exist for single words. So that's the first published demonstration of this, of how this tool can be used to look at problems in morphology that could not be resolved, in behavioral studies. So we can actually use neurophysiology to address non-neurophysiological problems, which is interesting in itself. And this syntactic lexical, or syntactic versus lexical double dissociation can be used to disentangle lexical versus syntactic relationships between items in complex forms. Now, having done this, you can also find that language is changing. That's a drink being sold, I think, in the Netherlands. It's called Cool Up. And that's an album by a band called The Roots, which is called Rising Down. So maybe fans of The Roots will not show this effect that we found for Rise Down versus Fall Down. Right. Now, the next part, going pretty well, is application of a similar paradigm to compound words. Again, I made a few examples at the beginning, and we can make a few again. What's happening with compound words? It's a scarcely studied topic. Are they lexicalized as big representations, single representations, or do we decompose them into parts, or do we do both, perhaps, as we discussed in relation to derivational morphology? It's easy to decompose. Red house should be together. It's easy to say that red house is red house. They're two separate words. So maybe you selectively parse this. And doghouse, it's an Americanism, is a house where your dog lives. So it's probably easy to parse that, segment that, and get the same sense. But what about greenhouse? And I'm not talking about greenhouse, guys. It's a kind of house, but it's not really green, is it? Well, the color might depend on what kind of things you grow it. So, is that transparent? And I'll remind you again of the example of snowman, which, was not really a man. So there are all these different complexities. Could it be that we're using different truths depending on the exact semantics of these words? So the question is, does the route that you take, decomposition versus whole form storage, depend on transparency? It could be possible that you can parse something like green bean easily because it's a green bean, but you would probably not succeed with greenhouse. Therefore, you may benefit from having a whole form storage for that. Now, there is another question that comes into play, is whether this would depend on the frequency. So some words you encounter quite frequently. If you study well, at least you get the word such as homework in English rather often. And being a frequent item that you have to use, you might want to lexicalize that and have a whole form storage just to have quick access. On the other hand, you don't really encounter something like bridge work. And bridge work is not something they're trying to do with a palace bridge right now, it's something they do with their teeth to fix them. So that's something you don't want to encounter very often in the first place. So would lexicalization or segmentation depend on frequency? That's another question. So we're trying to come up with a design that could account for all these things, and got a bunch of words, a bunch of English compounds, which were either transparent, such as homework, housework, teamwork, or opaque, so non-transparent. Framework has nothing to do with either frames or work, really, or clockwork, patchwork, bridge work. So these are different in their transparency, and both of these groups differ in their frequency. So there are some very frequent ones like housework, and some infrequent ones like desk work. In the same way, you have frequent framework and infrequent bridge work. And we complemented this by pseudo words that don't mean anything. Let's see what happens. Well, this is just to show you how we time locked to the onset of the second constituent, which will always work in this case. And What we find a clear response, we find a mismatch in the degree as well if we subtract standards from deviance, and we find, in global activation, we find 3 peaks, roughly 150, 300, and 400 milliseconds, which you could then analyze statistically. This is really a complicated study. I'll try to make sense of it as much as I can, but please stop me. I'll get confused myself probably. So when we look at opaque and transparent compounds, you will see that there seems to be a larger response to transparent than opaque ones. That's a comparison. So this is the difference that you see. Now, once we look at frequency effect, there seems to be a frequency increase as well. So you have a larger response to high frequency standards than for low frequencies, compounds. And unfortunately, it gets really more complicated. There is an interaction between the two. So when you look at just opaque, non-transparent combinations, so bridge work combinations, then you find a clear frequency effect. So you find the larger response for high frequency, so framework produces a larger response than bridge work. And that's exactly how the way I showed you earlier with high versus low monomorphic items. The better you know something, the stronger the memory trace is, the higher this passive response becomes. However, that does not seem, so when we pull these things apart, that doesn't seem to be happening for the transparent combinations at all. So this lexical frequency effect is not found for that transparent combinations here. Well, it's the same just shown with topographic maps. You also see some differences in topography, although they didn't become very significant. So that's again a demonstration that transparent items activate equally for high and low frequency, but opaque items have a strong difference. And here, alongside with this, there is quite a strong response to pseudo-compounds as well. The sources of frequency and transparency effects can be found in sort of traditional language areas all over the temporal lobe for transparency effect and inferior frontal areas as well, and inferior frontal areas on both sides for the frequency effect, just like we showed for monomorphic items. But it only exists for opaque compounds, as I said. So we need to get through this somehow. So we get high lexical frequency response bigger than low frequency. We have transparent response bigger than opaque response. But when we start looking into details, we also see that in transparent condition only, all these responses, high frequency and low frequency and pseudocompound, actually did not result in much of a difference. In opaque condition, there is a clear frequency effect. In opaque condition, you also find effect of high frequency words being bigger than pseudo words in response. So that's a lexicality type effect. But low frequency words are actually smaller than pseudo words, which is something we never saw before. So that all has to be explained somehow. And we've tried our best in a paper that Lucy and I have just published or got accepted in Brandon Language. So to look at it simply, high frequency versus low frequency difference seems to be a sign that high frequency compounds are more likely to be lexicalized. That makes sense, as we discussed a few minutes ago. You use something often, you want to have a single representation for that that's quickly and easily accessed. Now, when we look at this closer, like I said, it seems to be specific to opaque compounds rather than all compounds. So we also find high frequency opaque compounds bigger than pseudo compounds. But we don't find that effect. We don't find the frequency effect for transparent ones, where everything is the same, even pseudo compound shows the same effect. We also don't find frequency effect for the low frequency opaque, so where pseudo compound is actually a bigger response. So the only conclusion from this is that this is more like a syntactic pattern, larger response incongruous combination, which suggests that you attempt to parse syntactically a combination that is low frequency, even opaque, so that it may not be successful, but you still try. And you may also try segmentation of all transparent items. So there could be both going on, access and segmentation. So the absence of clear frequency effect for transparent items seems to be an evidence against pure lexicalized processing. On the other hand, the absence of word pseudo-word effect for transparent compounds seems to be an evidence against purely combinatorial processing. The way we took these data is that the meaning of these transparent compounds is computed online via combinatorial mechanism with simultaneous access to unitary lexical representations, possibly also to representations of constituents. So there seems to be a dual route access to transparent items, but not so much for non-transparent ones, especially for high-frequency ones. So what we seem to find is a sort of dual route mechanism where individual constituents are accessed and combinatorial processing, segmentation is attempted at the same time as direct access to whole form unitary representation. This lexicalization is stronger for more frequent compounds and especially for opaque, not transparent ones, where you would benefit from whole form representation, because trying to parse, to segment framework is not going to get you any good results. You have to represent it. You have to have a representation for that to understand what that means. So it seems like for opaque, direct access is dominant. And because combinatorial processing will simply fail, and therefore you will have to suppress your individual constituents. For transparent, it seems like both routes may be successful. So it seems like this is a case that demonstrates a sort of dynamic and flexible mechanism in brain processing of lexical items. And importantly, we can study this neurophysiologically, and we can show that these processes take place very, very quickly, from 150 milliseconds, and in a largely automatic fashion when subjects don't even pay attention. They might change once you start paying attention to stimuli, as Alina has shown. So we're done with particle verbs and compounds. There is a question?
Actually, I was just interested in one issue. Maybe the case that, for example, one should take into account not just the frequency of the compound,
but also the constituents.
The constituents. I mean, for example, if we think that, let's say, man is acts like an affix in this case, it is a known fact that sometimes, I mean, the speed depends on how large the family of certain items is. Absolutely. I think in this case we just try to match that to rule this, to take this out of the equation, because it would make it too complicated. So in this case, first constituents are close in their lexical frequency, and the second constituent is the same. So, but I agree, this can also influence the amount to which you would tend to parse. Maybe you would access, you would try segmenting more often if individual constituents are more frequent themselves. I mean, for example, if you tend to build more compounds using this man thing rather than, for example, this work thing, for example, the number of just simply compound, the productivity of this, let's say, ethics is larger.
What do you mean? Yeah, I think that's another thing. Yeah, so yeah, all these factors are likely to play a role, but we can, in experiments like this, we can only take them out one by one, more or less. And that's probably the second experiment in the world on spoken compound processing in EEG. And there was very little work in visual compound processing too. One probably would like to argue that this is the case where visual and spoken processing would have to be quite different, because the information for visual compound is available immediately.
You have it all at once, the whole word. Here you have to wait until you know it's not clock, it's clockwork. So you have to access one thing, then you have to rule it out and access something else. Now another kind of English-specific issue is that of past tense processing. Are regular past tense verbs, so jumped, walked, are they stored lexically, or are they generated productively? Are they segmented? Always by applying the affixation rule. Well, that's something that Alina covered reasonably well. Also using similar things from Finnish, but here I'll just make an example of a study which was run by my master student from Amsterdam, Iske Bakker, who wanted to test this using the same design, having different combinations. But let's first get through the background. So again, there is a dual root approach to this. That is that you store you go through combinatorial route for regular past forms such as jumped, closed, carried. But in English, you also have irregular past. You have leapt, shot, brought, things that don't have a clear affix in them. Although some argue actually find certain regularities in those as well, historically inherited from Old English and Germanic roots. So the argument of the dual root model is that those have to be stored as whole form representations. Otherwise, you can't do anything with them. And there is also a single root approach, which is an approach that comes from computational neuroscience, a connectionist approach where everything sort of is one big mishmash of statistical probabilities, and things that you encounter more often get stored in one way, and other things you encounter are stored in different ways. So everything is stored, but everything is stored in the same way. And one spin on it, on the dual approach, has been put by William Wilson and Bonnie Tyler in Cambridge, who suggested that anything that can be potentially a past tense is decomposed even if it isn't. So if you hear a word like spend, you still try to get to decompose it into spend and past tense ed. And you do this, and then you fail, and you have to go back and access perhaps the whole form for this. Or if you hear a word like trade, which is not really a past tense, it's a noun, but you will still try to decompose the trade in the past tense of trade. Something was trade, maybe brought on a tray or something like that. So you try that, and you fail, and go back to the whole form. And what they found is so-called inflectional rhyme pattern. So it takes, for agreement in voicing, it has to be a D or a T, and it has to agree in the voicing with previous sound. So let's see what we can do with these approaches in our simple minimalistic design. So what Iske Bakker did is, and this is just published in Neuroimage, she came up again with a set of words and pseudo-words which were either clearly monomorphic or bimorphic. And monomorphic contrast included high versus hide. Both are monomorphic items. You have a D in the end, just like you would have in a verb, but it's not a verb. You also have a pseudo-word, smide, again the same standard deviant contrast, just addition of a single D in the end. And you have a monomorphic stem cry, which becomes bimorphic past tense cried. That is a high frequency item, high frequency verb. You can take a low frequency verb, plied, and it's past tense plied, which is something you probably never encountered at all, but it's a low frequency English verb. It's the same frequency question, where the high frequency items might be more likely to lexicalize than low frequency items. So that's why this cry and ply are there. And finally, a pseudo word, which is clearly a bimorphic one because it has a stem, it's flied. So it's something that does not exist in English, but which you can actually segment. Because fly is an irregular verb, which you have to say flew instead. Flew, flow, rather than flight.
So, and she again compares these mismatching behavior responses obtained in non-attend passive presentation to these different items. She did a very good job matching the stimuli, glued the same final D to all of these, they were equal in length and so on. And what are the predictions? If past tenses are stored as predicted by single root models, as a unitary form, then I might be simplifying the single root account to an extent here for the sake of this contrast. Then we'd see something like a lexical element. We'd see that grammatical forms will produce a larger response than ungrammatical. So cried should be bigger than flied if this is stored lexically as a whole form. We probably will not see a difference between ungrammatical and pseudo word. So again, flied should be the same as smite, which is a pseudo word. And we should see a frequency effect. Lexical processing seems to lead to higher response to high frequency than to low frequency objects. Now, if on the other hand, past tenses are parsed, if they're segmented, then we would see a syntactic pattern. Larger response to ungrammatical items, bigger response to flight than to real grammatical ones. We probably will not see a frequency effect, because we don't know frequency effects for syntactic stimuli. We don't know how pseudo word exactly will behave, whether it will be parsed or not. And finally, if the inflectional rhyme pattern idea takes place everywhere, then we should probably see equal responses throughout the experiment. If everything is decomposed, everything should be the same. So let's see what happens. That's the first contrast is monomorphic items. Word versus pseudo word shows a clear lexical effect. So you see an increased response for real monomorphic word versus hide, as opposed to pseudo word smite. So this is, in spite of the potential presence of an affix, you may want to get the D out and try to see whether you end up with a past tense. You seem to have a lexical pattern, an increased response for meaningful monomorphic word. When we look at bimorphic items, then we find the syntactic pattern. We find the biggest response to be produced by grammatically, syntactically incongruous combinations. So the flight, a syntactic error, generates the largest response. Both low and high frequency verbs, so plied and cried, produce smaller responses. They don't show a difference between themselves. If anything, low frequency response is bigger than high frequency word response, so it's obviously against the lexical pattern that you would expect from monomorphic representations. So we seem to be seeing, this is an example of this activation for grammatical contrast taking place in temporal lobes as well as inferior central and inferior frontal areas that shows big activation for ungrammatical and grammatical combinations. So what we seem to see here is similar response to in bimorphic items to high and low frequency items. So the polite cried combination is not compatible with lexical, but is compatible with syntactic combination. Interestingly, we also found a slightly but significantly delayed latency of bimorphic responses as opposed to monomorphic ones. So they were 9 milliseconds later, which seems like a small time, but it's significant. So the only explanation is that you need some extra time to process these bimorphic items, even though they're same in length. So maybe it is the extra time that you take to analyze affix, as opposed to not having to do that. So it seems that we have, again, a nice double dissociation. And it seems that these data can confirm that affixed regular past tense does go through decomposition, through kind of dual root. Model can be confirmed here. This can be seen as larger amplitude for monomorphic items of the pseudo-words, as frequency effects, as well as latency delays. We don't seem to be confirming single roots, so we don't find our data fully compatible with unified representations for everything. We don't find evidence of lexicalization of properly formed biomorphic past tense verbs. The idea that you parse everything according to inflection rhyme pattern idea of Marcel, Wilson, and Tyler does not seem to be confirmed. Although I have to say it cannot be ruled out either, because if this process takes place in all of these situations equally, but in addition to the other processes, we might not notice it here. So with the condition that it always takes place, but there are others that overtake, it might still be there. And I think I probably need to stop here, because that's the last study that Alina showed. That's the one we did together, and we're currently revising. But it used the same approach of dissociation between high and low frequency and words and pseudo-words to look at Finnish derivational and inflection morphology. And to cut the long story short, here we find that derived and inflected words show different brain response patterns. We seem to find that frequent complex words show stronger memory circuits, but for both derived and inflected, but that's especially true for derived. So stronger memory representations, that is full form representations for derived words, which may not be the case for inflected ones. And thus inflected words are more likely to be parsed. So all in all, it implies distinct brain mechanisms for the processing of these two types of morphology. And I'd like to remind you of what an example of the patient HH made yesterday by Lucien, who showed wonderful dissociation between this person being able to read derivations and completely blind to inflections. That's a very interesting case. So to make overall conclusions, we can find lexicalized status of phrasal verbs. We can find that for compound processing there seems to be a dynamic multiple root kind of access going on. We can find that English past tense seems to follow decompositional dual root processing. We find distinct roots for derivations and inflections in Finnish, and we've also done a similar study with Caroline Whiting in Cambridge, confirming the same thing, in that case mostly as a lateralization difference, where the same contrast led to significantly left lateralized activation of temporofrontal inflectional network, as they like to call it, as opposed to derivational forms. So it seems like we can actually use neurophraseology to address linguistic problems, such as the nature of morphosyntactic mechanisms that could not even be resolved in behavioral studies. And when doing so, not only do we find relative response size and timing, something we could find from button press tasks, but we also show a lot more. We show spatial temporal dynamics of underlying brain activation. And again, I'd like to thank the many people who took part in these studies: Bert Capelli, Iski Bakker, Lucy Margaria, Alina Levin here, Friedrich Luffenberger, and a host of other people. The funders, Medical Research Council, Helsinki University, and the Central Hospital, again, the Finland European Commission, and many others whom I'm sure we forgot to mention. And thank you for your attention. Any questions left? I think everybody's tired, but before I let you go, I'd really like to thank the organizers of this thing, and I think we need to thank especially two people who are here, and that's Alexander Nikolaev, who initiated the whole thing, got lots of money for us to bring the students here, and that's Anton Markov from St. Petersburg, who deal with this wonderful organization during this time. I think you guys have been wonderful. It's really great.
Thank all our beautiful researchers and for free, so without any money for this. So thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
Now, some of us are going to a nearby pub. Well,